Picture this. You're watching a close game with the boys, got the snacks and drinks out, going crazy on big plays, laughing your life away, just praying that your team pulls it out. Then, all of a sudden, it ends, but it's still tied. That can happen? Today we explore the long yet scarce history of the all-forbidden, player and fan-hated tie. And believe it or not, the tie is just about as old as the NFL itself, dating all the way back to the first year of the league in 1920, when it went by the American Professional Football Association, or APFA. And this video gets hot right off the bat because, funny enough, this first 1920 season had the most ties of any season in NFL history, with 17. That is 17 ties in just a 13-week season, and if you like defense, you may want to rewatch some of this stuff. Of those 17 ties in 1920, 13 of them were 0-0 ties. No points were scored in basically one game every week. The very first tie in league history, well, ironically, it's a tie. In week 3, there were two ties, both 0-0 games between four teams named the Triangles, Cardinals, Tigers, and Tigers. Awesome century-old marketing work. Now, why were there so many ties in this first year of the NFL? And why were so many of them 0-0 games? Well, there's two simple answers. First, there was no overtime yet. That literally didn't exist. So if a game was tied at the end of the fourth, that's that. Goodbye. And so that explains why ties are so prevalent. I mean, there was 20 overtime games last year alone, but why were so many games 0-0? Well, because this is what APFA skill level was like. Alright, I'm sorry, a little slower. Watch number 25. If I ain't eating, I ain't playing, coach. Remember, this is 47 years before the first Super Bowl even kicked off and started the era of football that we know today. And so for a long while, the league continued this way, racking up crazy high numbers of ties. There's a lot of data here, but if you look closer and sift through it, there's some real special ties that start to reveal themselves. In 1932, ties prompted one of the most important games in NFL history. The Chicago Bears and Portsmouth Spartans tied both of their regular season games this year, then finished tied for first place in the NFL. The Bears finished with a record of 6-1-6, and the Spartans at 6-1-4. Jesus, that is a lot of ties. And there was no Super Bowl or championship game at the time, so whoever finished first in the NFL was league champion. But that was decided by win percentage, which was equal here. So the league went on to their tiebreaker, which was who won when they played. But they tied both times. So the league went to the next tiebreaker, who won the most recent time they played. But they tied both times. The NFL's rule in deciding who was champion was basically proven useless in this situation, and the 1932 NFL commissioner faced a very tough situation. With no tiebreaker to lean on, they decided to play an extra single-game playoff to decide who would get the first place crown. This was unprecedented for the NFL at the time, and the single-game playoff still remains as such in the league. The Bears won the game 9-0 and were crowned NFL champions. This game generated so much interest from the public though, people went so crazy at the idea that the NFL instantly decided to split into two divisions and play a championship game at the end of each season. They started the very next year in 1933, and though this 1932 game isn't credited as the first, it served as the blueprints for what would later become the NFL Championship and Super Bowl. And it was all made possible because of a couple ties. A few more decades of high tide seasons brings us to 1964. A quick stop. It's actually the AFL, but the Raiders and Patriots clashed this game and threw out the stereotype that ties are boring. In a 43 to 43 point shootout, this is the single highest scoring tie of all time. That is 86 points, all scored in regulation, and it ended with a play so special that it wasn't even possible in the league for over 36 years. The final play of this game, delivered by Raiders kicker Mike Mercer, was a walk-off to tie field goal, ending the game in deadlock. After a few more years, the NFL started the Super Bowl, and a little while after that came the great reckoning of tie football games. In 1974, overtime was finally introduced into the NFL regularly. The previous 54 years had seen 256 total ties in the league. That's over 4 a year. With sudden death overtime rules ending the game as soon as any score was made by either team, the next 38 years would see just 17 total ties. We now had to search harder to find ties, even harder to find the beautiful few out there. Teams had to play an entire fifth quarter's worth of football, 15 more minutes without even a field goal, to reach Tietopia. The first regular season overtime game in NFL history came later that year, in '74. It wasn't the very first overtime game ever, see the 58 championship or the 72 divisional playoffs, but it still marked the beginning of the modern overtime era. And proving itself as an outlier, the Broncos and Steelers gave a big middle finger to the overtime rules, and both didn't score in overtime, rendering the first usage of these new sudden death rules a tie. But that does prove to be a rare occurrence, and ties start to get unprecedentedly rare, barely happening every other year. Ties become games that were only possible because of huge mistakes, red zone turnovers, poor clock management, and the best tie creator of them all, the missed field goal. Ties were almost bred through missed field goals. Not only do you have to take the ball down the field using up time, but then you miss a field goal. Your opponent gets the ball in not great field position, and they too have to drive down right after they thought their game was over. And if you get real lucky, they miss a field goal too. I mean, the more the merrier. I just described most modern NFL ties for you. But ties still had this unique stranglehold, and they kept making weird impacts whenever they did pop up. In 1978, the Vikings beat the Packers, then they tied them in the regular season. Both teams finished at 8-7-1, and instead of looking at the second game they played, which was a tie, they had to look at the first, which the Vikings won, sending them to the playoffs, and proving it's the first time a tie came up in notable rankings. In 1982, the Colts and Packers played even football, tying 20-20. Due to a strike-shortened season that year, the Colts finished 0-8-1. With the tie serving as their only non-loss of the season. The very next year, 83, we saw the first and only Monday Night Football tie to date in the NFL. This was almost solely made possible by my good friend Neil O'Donoghue, who had a 59% career field goal rate, by the way. On primetime TV, Neil missed not one, not two, but 3 kicks, all in overtime. The second kick he missed was a 20-yarder. That is the equivalent to the old NFL extra point. It was either a really tough night for Neil, or he really likes ties. As we move along, you'll notice a scary trend. The charm of the fully equal game was already a sight for few eyes, but through the turn of the century, it slipped more and more out of grasp. Ties became less, their unique influence growing more scarce by the year. We saw clumps of seasons with no ties at all. I mean, it's fun to make jokes and go into why they happened, but remember how the broader sense of people feel about tie games. I mean, how do you feel about ties? Remember that. Most people don't like them. Most people hate when they're announced. Literally every modern tie sends a small subset of fans petitioning to ban them. As you can probably tell though, I like ties. As we watched the dwindling of the tie game happen right in front of our very eyes, a big moment happened. The very moment that needed to happen. November 16th, 2008. Bengals-Eagles. The cross-conference opponents played deadlocked through regulation and can't find a winner in overtime. For the first time in 5 years in the NFL, two teams finally tie. It's a dying art, but after this game, the tie was brought to center attention of the media in probably its biggest moment ever. Eagles quarterback Donovan McNabb admitted in his post-game press conference that he didn't even know the NFL could end in tie games.
You knew the game was over when it was over?
Well, when the play was called, I kind of figured that I guess there's ties in the NFL. So,
You seriously didn't know?
No, I didn't know
You
that.
thought it was like another overtime?
Yeah.
This moment was catapulted to the mainstream media, and discussion about the tie game was as rampant as ever. And Donovan McNabb, yes, he should have known this, but for him and a whole new generation of NFL fans, ties were somewhat of a foreign concept. This was a new league. There had been 3 ties in the last 20 years before this game. A lot of people watching had never seen one. With the tie in everyone's mind and clearly hanging on by a thread in the league, something needed to be done. And I can't say how much influence Donovan McNabb's interview had on this, but just a couple years later, in 2012, the NFL changed its overtime rules, requiring a touchdown to instantly end the game. With just a field goal, the other team would get the chance to match or beat that. This change was able to bring the tie back to a much more stable spot, doubling the amount of games, albeit with a smaller sample size. We saw about a tie a year for a few years, normalizing it to a degree. In 2014, the Panthers and Bengals put up 37 points each, good for the highest scoring tie in the modern NFL. In 2017, another small change shortened overtime from 15 to 10 minutes for injury prevention, which predictably has made ties a bit more common. And because of that, we've gotten to see some of the most special ties play out in recent years. That 2017 season, the Browns went 0-16. Riding that into week 1 of 2018, the Browns broke their long losing streak. Not by winning, but with a tie, because they're the Browns. Then they lost again the next week, now riding just a winless streak. The Packers tied the Vikings also in 2018 after a series of missed kicks. Mason Crosby made a game winner as time expired in regulation, but the Vikings just got a timeout off, leading to a miss and overtime. There, the Vikings missed 2 kicks of their own, including one as the clock expired in OT. The very next day, the Vikings cut their kicker, Daniel Carlson. Kickers getting cut is sort of a byproduct of ties. Now, we've talked about the Packers a few times, and that makes sense, because this was their 6th tie in franchise history, more than any other team has ever racked up in modern overtime rules. With 2 ties in this single season too, 2018 was the first season to do that since 1997. Don't call it a comeback. The Lions and Cardinals played the next year in what may be the most preventable tie in NFL history. Deep into overtime, the Lions have the ball and are seeing if they can make any sort of magic happen. Matthew Stafford makes an unbelievably horrible decision and lets this throw off towards the sideline that Tremaine Brock somehow, someway, did not intercept. 2020 had a tie brought to us not by kickers, but by punters. The Eagles and Bengals both really did not want to win and just kept giving the other team the ball, punting 6 total times in a 10-minute overtime period. The game ended, and it's perfect. The Eagles were ready to kick a long field goal. They go offsides. Pushes them back. They decide to punt. It ends on a 9-yard halfback dive. Unappetizing football. With the Eagles and Bengals also having tied at the Donovan McNabb game, this wasn't the first time two same opponents tied each other twice, but it was the first and only time two cross-conference opponents did this. The odds of that are pretty crazy. And just a year ago, in Week 18 of the 2022 NFL season, football fans learned that no matter how hated and outdated the tie was, it still had unseen tricks up its sleeve. The final week of the regular season, the Chargers and Raiders were placed in a peculiar situation in which it was sort of beneficial for these teams to tie their final Week 18 game. With just two AFC playoff spots open, both these teams and the Steelers were vying for the postseason, but one of the three wasn't going to make it. Whichever team won the matchup here between the Chargers and Raiders would be in and the loser out, making this a makeshift playoff game. Someone had to win and therefore someone had to lose. Or did they? The unforeseen third option, it being a regular season game, the two teams could tie, in which they both owned a tiebreaker over the Steelers, guaranteeing they would make the playoffs and the Steelers wouldn't. Fans and media caught on to this possibility before the game started, and it created a large amount of hype that would fuel one of the strangest games in recent history. The Wall Street Journal even ran an article a few days before the game where they interviewed Wall Street economists about the game theory both teams faced and the possibility of forcing a tie. When the game arrived, everything else fell into place perfectly. The Colts were the Colts, and fans watched intently with jaws dropped as the Chargers made a beautiful fourth quarter comeback. With a last-second touchdown pass, it somehow, stupidly, seemed possible. The teams headed into overtime, all tied up. The internet's dream started to become a reality. After trading field goals in overtime, time ticked down slowly. No way this was going to happen. And then, with an absolute gut punch, the Raiders sent out their kicker, Daniel Carlson. You remember, the guy the Vikings cut after he caused a tie with the Packers? Now, he was the one to destroy all hopes of collusion tie memery and blocked the intentional tie from falling into place. The Raiders had the chance, but they put the blade right in the heart of the Chargers. Ties are a magic thing. You know I like them. I mean, they always spice things up whenever they're in the mix. They're just abnormal. Ties mess with everyone, which is fun to me. It's like with positive and negative numbers. Then 0 just waltzes on in to screw everything up. Ties are the number 0 of the NFL, and I love them for it. I think right now is probably the healthiest period in NFL history in terms of how many ties we're getting. That 6 to 7% range seems to be a money spot. So honestly, I know it's a hot take, but I hope we keep ties right where they are, and I hope they keep messing up everything they interact with. A couple quick fun facts if you're still here. There has never been a 0-0 tie since the introduction of overtime, despite how common that was way back when. And on that note, if you're familiar with scoregami, ties are also a goldmine for that stuff, given their rarity. The Panthers-Bengals 37-point tie was unsurprisingly a scoregami, and is still the only occurrence of that score. The 1919 tie happened just once too, over 100 years ago. Same thing with the 26 and 29-point ties, both of them happening between the Packers and Vikings in the last 10 years, odd enough. And then there's a few juicy spots open for the taking in tie games too. We've never seen an 8, 9, 25, or 32-point tie.
Jeff Saturday loved the double tap. He loved me constantly spanking him, right? He preferred the double